to think as deep.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are diving deep into something that, well, for many people outside and even inside Japan, might seem relatively stable, maybe even a bit mundane,
Right.
But it has recently become a national flashpoint, causing widespread concern. We're talking about the price of rice.
Yeah, rice. For a country like Japan, where rice isn't just a dietary staple, but is so deeply interwoven with culture, history, national identity.
Exactly. Seeing prices unexpectedly soar has caused quite a stir.
Mm.
It's an issue that's been dramatic enough that some people are even calling it the Reiwa rice riot.
And what's fascinating here is precisely that point you made about rice being more than just food. It's a cornerstone, really.
It is.
So when its price suddenly sees such volatility, it impacts people on a much deeper level. It immediately grabs national attention because it touches every household, right?
Right.
And it challenges that fundamental expectation that this most essential commodity will remain affordable and, stable.
Exactly. And to help us understand this complex situation, this deep dive is built on the sources you've provided. We're pulling key insights from discussions with experts, various stakeholders in the agricultural sector, politicians, and yes, even direct input from the Minister of Agriculture himself.
That's quite a range of perspectives.
It is. Our mission here is to sift through these sources, extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, and help you understand what truly caused this sudden and, frankly, alarming price spike.
And also how the Japanese government has reacted.
Yes, and crucially, what this all means for the long-term future of rice and agriculture in Japan. It's a picture with many layers, definitely.
But we're going to try and make sense of it together.
We are.
Absolutely. So let's get started by really grasping the scale of the problem that triggered this whole conversation.
Let's do it. The first thing that just leaps out from your sources is just how dramatic this price hike was. I mean, this wasn't just a small incremental increase that you might shrug off as typical inflation.
No, not at all.
We're told that rice prices in some areas, and for certain types of rice, didn't just rise by a percentage point or two. They, in some cases, doubled.
Doubled. Wow.
Or even went up by 2.5 times within the span of a single year.
Just 1 year. That is an absolutely massive jump.
It is, and it's consistently described in the sources as an abnormal situation.
Okay.
Particularly because, we're talking about the primary staple food for the country.
That scale of increase really puts it into perspective. If we look at the broader economic context provided in your sources, overall food inflation in Japan, according to the Consumer Price Index, was around, 3.8%?
Around there, yeah.
And specific food items were up around 8% year on year. Now, that's significant in itself and maybe higher than inflation rates seen in many places in the U.S. or Europe at the time.
Right.
But rice dramatically outpaced even that 8% figure. It became a real outlier, even within the context of general food price rises.
That's a key point.
And it's interesting to note how other staples reacted. The dim, bread prices, for instance, didn't see anywhere near this kind of jump.
No.
Which, of course, made bread, which is typically seen as a secondary staple, suddenly feel relatively much cheaper to consumers.
And this price shock had a very real and immediate impact on you, the consumer, hitting household budgets hard across the country. Your sources specifically reference the Engels coefficient, which, just as a reminder, measures the proportion of household income spent on food.
Right. How much of your paycheck goes to groceries, basically.
Exactly. The sources indicate this coefficient has risen significantly, reaching its highest point since the 1980s.
Since the 80s. That's telling.
It really tells us that a larger slice of people's income is now being dedicated just to feeding the family. And as you'd expect, this disproportionately affects lower-income households and those on fixed incomes, like pension recipients.
Yeah, people who, by definition, spend a larger percentage of their limited income on essential goods like food anyway, they feel it first and hardest.
Absolutely.
This leads directly to a crucial consequence for consumer behavior, doesn't it?
It does.
When rice, the traditional, deeply ingrained core of the Japanese diet, suddenly becomes significantly more expensive, people start making difficult choices. They start looking for alternatives.
Yeah. Your sources extensively discuss a phenomenon being observed called rice separation, or kombinare in Japanese.
Kombinare, right.
This describes a measurable shift away from rice and towards other, now relatively cheaper, carbohydrate sources like bread, noodles, cereal, that sort of thing.
And the major worry highlighted in the sources, I think, is that this shift, initially driven purely by price and necessity, might become a permanent change in dietary habit.
That's the fear, isn't it?
Yeah, potentially impacting rice consumption patterns long into the future, even if prices eventually stabilize.
Yeah.
That cultural link starts to fray a bit.
And it wasn't just individual shoppers who were feeling the heat. Businesses that rely heavily on rice were hit extremely hard as well.
Oh, I bet. Restaurants, for example.
Restaurants, particularly those specializing in dishes where rice is central, had to make difficult decisions. For example, shops selling onigiri, rice balls, which are a ubiquitous, usually affordable snacks or white meal.
A staple snack.
They had to raise their prices significantly. A jump of 100 per onigiri is quite substantial on a relatively low-cost item.
That's a big percentage increase.
Huge. Even places that traditionally offered all-you-can-eat rice, which is a common service at certain types of restaurants.
Right, like yakiniku places or set meal restaurants.
Exactly. They found that the cost of providing unlimited rice became simply prohibitive and had to stop. That fundamentally alters their business model and what they could offer customers.
So the sudden and unexpected spike in rice prices wasn't just some abstract economic data point. It had these tangible disruptive effects cascading through everyday life.
Absolutely. From putting pressure on family dinner tables to changing the economics of local eateries.
And this widespread sense of crisis and discontent is what ultimately prompted a response from the government. And that response itself turned out to be swift, but also quite politically charged.
Yes.
Which is where the story gets really interesting, I think.
Here's where it gets really interesting, highlights some of the systemic issues. Your sources point out that despite the Japanese government having a significant stockpile of rice, known as bijikumai, specifically intended for times of emergency or supply disruption.
They have this reserve, right?
They do. But this rice wasn't reaching consumers quickly enough through the established channels.
Why not? What was the holdup?
Well, the traditional method for selling off government stockpile rice is through general competitive bidding, or ikan kishujusatsu.
Okay, competitive bidding. Sounds standard.
It is, in normal times.
Mhm.
The logic behind this is that the stockpile is state property, and the standard procedure is to sell it at the highest possible price to maximize value for the public purse. Makes sense on paper.
Right. Get the best price for the taxpayer's asset.
But in the face of this rapidly escalating price crisis, this competitive bidding process, which involves various steps and waiting for bids and so on, it became a major bottleneck.
Ah, okay. It was just too slow.
Exactly. It was simply too slow to get the rice onto store shelves quickly enough to impact the soaring consumer prices.
And what's particularly fascinating here is the political dimension that seems to have accelerated the response. Your sources suggest that a key turning point was actually a change in the Minister of Agriculture.
That's right.
The appointment of Koizumi Shinjiro to this role is described as somewhat of a surprise move by the prime minister at the time.
A surprise, yeah.
And the interpretation offered in the sources is that this was intended to be a game-changer appointment, like a bold political maneuver driven by a growing sense of crisis within the government.
And maybe falling approval ratings playing a part.
Possibly, yeah. A backdrop of falling public approval ratings. The goal was clearly to signal decisive action and, get the situation under control quickly, show they were doing something.
And the decisive action that followed was indeed a major shift in strategy for dealing with the stockpile. Instead of sticking to the slower, general competitive bidding.
Which wasn't working out fast enough.
Right. The government decided to move towards using negotiated contracts, or zuyaku, for the stockpile rice.
Negotiated contracts, so bypassing the bidding process.
Essentially, yes. The primary why behind this shift, as detailed in the sources, was to bypass the complex, multi-layered traditional distribution system, which we'll definitely get into more detail on later, and get the rice directly and rapidly to retailers and businesses that would then sell it to consumers.
Speed and directness, that was the goal.
That was the key.
Implementing this required navigating some significant legal hurdles, though, right? You can't just ignore standard government accounting rule.
No, you can't. Standard government accounting law, the accounting law, actually not a kaikendu, typically mandates competitive bidding for the disposal of state assets. That's to ensure transparency and value.
So how did they get around that?
Well, your sources describe how the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Agriculture ultimately found a way to allow this shift to negotiated contracts. It seems they achieved this by interpreting the existing law and its operational guidelines flexibly.
Ah, flexible interpretation, often key in a crisis.
It was justified based on the assessment of an urgent situation, and relied significantly on the final judgment call made by the new agriculture minister to prioritize addressing the public crisis over the standard process.
So the minister basically made the call.
It sounds like it. It really highlights how crisis situations can sometimes force a reevaluation and, well, a flexible interpretation of established rules and regulations.
And the speed of the rollout once that decision was made was truly surprising, wasn't it? That seems to be a key factor in the government's success in stabilizing the immediate situation.
Absolutely critical. The sources indicate the new minister was appointed in late May, and remarkably, the stockpile rice started appearing in stores incredibly quickly. Some accounts even say as early as late May.
Wow, that's fast.
With a broader rollout in early June. This required an enormous effort, apparently, from dedicated ministry staff working overtime and close cooperation with private companies.
So a real mobilization effort.
It sounds like it. Your sources mentioned specific companies participating, like Iris Ohima, a major manufacturer and retailer, large supermarket chains. And later, the program was expanded to include small and medium-sized retailers and even convenience stores.
Getting it out widely.
And there's even a fascinating detail about JR East, the railway company, assisting with transport.
JR East? How?
Using their Shinkansen, the bullet trains, to speed up the movement of rice across the country.
Moving rice by bullet train, that's something.
Isn't it? And JR East also apparently offered branded rice at lower prices in their own stores, using point subsidies for consumers. It just shows this multi-pronged, urgent effort involving both public and private sectors.
And this rapid and, importantly, highly visible deployment of stockpile rice had a palpable and immediate impact on prices, didn't it?
It did. Prices for standard branded rice varieties, which had reached those exorbitant peaks around $48,500 per 60-kilogram bag, they began to fall noticeably.
Like how much?
Dropping, for example, to around $37,000. The government's communicated target price range for a 5-kilogram bag of rice nationally was around the 3,000s.
Was it the big drop from where things were?
A significant reduction from the previous average retail price, which was closer to $4,200. And the stockpile rice itself was released at an even lower price point, initially at around $2,000 for 5 kilograms, and later further reduced to $1,800.
Making it significantly more affordable for consumers, right? A clear signal.
A very clear signal. And perhaps even more crucial than the direct price impact was how this speedy rollout changed market psychology and public perception.
The psychology part, always important in markets.
Absolutely. By quickly releasing a large volume of stockpile rice, and importantly, communicating very clearly and repeatedly that the stockpile was effectively unlimited in its capacity to meet demand.
Sending the message, don't panic, we've got this.
Exactly. The government aimed to break the expectation that prices would continue to rise indefinitely. Your sources mention a poll showing that after the stockpile release began, over half of people surveyed expected rice prices to fall.
That's a significant shift in expectation.
Vital, because it reduces the incentive for both consumers and businesses to engage in speculative hoarding. Buying up rice now because they anticipate having to pay much more later.
If you think the price is going down tomorrow, you wait to buy, right?
Precisely. The message was powerful and psychological. The supply is coming, don't wait for higher prices, because they are expected to go down.
So while the government's immediate response was swift, decisive, and seemingly effective in the short term, bringing down the price spike, calming the market,
It worked in that sense, yeah.
this crisis also threw a harsh spotlight on the underlying issues that made the system vulnerable in the first place. It wasn't just about having a stockpile and releasing it.
No, it went deeper than that.
It was about understanding why the normal mechanisms failed and prices soared so dramatically, even with what appeared to be sufficient production initially.
Which leads us directly to that core question.
Right.
What actually caused this shortage? Or, perhaps more accurately, this price hike and the feeling of a shortage?
Right. Was it a real physical shortage or something else?
It's not a simple answer, and your sources present a bit of a paradox that needs unpacking. On the one hand, the yield index, known as Sakishisu, for the previous year was reported as 101.
100, and 100 is average, right?
Correct. This index measures the overall harvest compared to an average year. So a score of 101 suggests a slightly above average harvest, implying there wasn't a production shortage in terms of total volume.
Okay, so production volume looked okay on paper.
Yet, despite this seemingly good harvest number, prices soared. This discrepancy leads some, in your sources, to question the reliability or perhaps the granularity of government statistics.
How so?
For instance, weather conditions, even if they result in a high total volume harvested, can affect the quality of the rice.
So maybe not all of it was good enough to eat?
Potentially. Rice that doesn't meet the standard for consumption might be diverted to other uses, like animal feed. So while the overall yield might be high, the amount of rice suitable and available for human consumption might have been lower than that headline number suggested.
That's a critical point. It highlights that the problem might not have been a literal physical shortage of rice everywhere, but rather a shortage feeling, or hinbusokukan, that permeated the market.
A perception issue, almost.
Your sources seem to lean towards this interpretation, suggesting that market perception, combined with structural factors, played a very significant role in driving prices up, perhaps even more so than a genuine widespread deficit in the amount of rice harvested.
And a major structural factor contributing to that perception of scarcity, even if the actual volume was okay, seems to be Japan's complex, multi-layered rice distribution system.
Yes, the distribution maze. Let's break this down a bit.
Okay. It typically starts with individual farmers, many of whom are small scale.
Very small scale often, yeah.
They traditionally sell their harvested rice to the local agricultural cooperatives, known as JA, Japan Agricultural Cooperative.
JA, a huge player.
From there, the rice is consolidated and typically moves up to ZENO, which is the National Federation of Agricultural Cooperatives. ZENO acts as this massive consolidator and primary distributor.
Okay, so JA collects locally, ZENO handles it nationally.
Pretty much. After ZENO, the rice usually goes through a series of wholesalers, primary wholesalers, then secondary, and sometimes even tertiary wholesalers.
Wow, multiple layers of wholesalers.
Yeah, before finally reaching retailers like supermarkets, smaller rice shapes, or businesses like restaurants. It's a long chain with multiple handoffs.
And what's fascinating here is how this multi-layered structure, particularly Zeno's dominant role, seems to have contributed directly to that shortage feeling.
How did that work?
Well, your sources explain that large wholesalers, who typically buy significant volumes from Zeno, didn't always receive the full amounts they requested.
So Zeno wasn't fulfilling the orders?
Not always completely, it seems. Zeno serves a vast network of clients, and perhaps due to internal logistics, allocation decisions, or even just conservative management of their stock, they weren't fulfilling all orders completely or promptly.
So if you're a big wholesaler...
Right. If you're a large wholesaler, not getting the full volume you expected creates immediate uncertainty. You start thinking, uh-oh, is rice getting scarce? And that perception then rippled outwards.
Exactly. When large wholesalers couldn't get all the rice they needed through the traditional Zeno channel, they increasingly turned to the spot market, Soppocho Shiju.
The spot market, what's that exactly?
It's basically a market operating outside the main structured channels. Transactions there are often more direct, and prices are much more volatile. They react really rapidly to supply and demand signals.
Okay, so a faster, less predictable market.
Right. And as more demand shifted to this spot market because traditional channels weren't fully delivering, prices on the spot market began to rise sharply.
Basic supply and demand kicking in there.
Totally. And this rising spot price then influenced expectations and prices even within the traditional channels, creating this kind of feedback loop that drove prices up across the board and just reinforced that shortage feeling.
And this complex maze also, unfortunately, provided opportunities for some players in the middle layers to benefit significantly from the rising prices, didn't it?
Yes, that's another angle. Your sources mentioned an investigation that highlighted significant profit margins being added at the wholesaler level.
Profit-taking.
It looks like it. There's a striking example cited where a primary wholesaler added a margin of around $7,000 to the price of rice between buying it and selling it on.
$7,000, is that normal?
Well, your sources suggest that typical costs and a reasonable profit for that step might only justify around $1,000 of that amount.
So an extra $6,000 margin. Wow.
Yeah. It indicates that some entities within the distribution chain were able to extract substantial additional profit during the crisis, basically exploiting the price volatility and the perception of scarcity.
And that brings us to another related factor, speculation and hoarding.
Right. Because with prices rising and the market feeling tight,
people get nervous.
Exactly. Various players in the supply chain, including retailers, wholesalers, and possibly even some farmers or agricultural cooperatives, may have engaged in a waiting-and-seeing strategy, holding on to stock because they anticipated further price increases.
Which makes sense from their individual perspective, maybe. If you think the price will be higher tomorrow,
you hold on to it today. It isn't necessarily malicious, but it's rational economic behavior in that context. However, when many players do it simultaneously, It just exacerbates the perceived scarcity. It becomes a form of deliberate or maybe passive hoarding.
It's not unlike the consumer behavior we saw during the early days of the pandemic with things like toilet paper. Right.
Exactly like that. The fear of not having enough, coupled with rising demand, prompts people to buy more than they immediately need, which empties shelves and makes the shortage feel real, even if the total supply in the system is theoretically sufficient.
And this cycle of perception, holding back stock, and rising prices just fueled the crisis further.
It seems so. So it's clear it wasn't just one simple cause like a bad harvest.
Yeah.
It was really a confluence of factors.
Yeah, a perfect storm almost. A paradox between reported yield and available consumption rice.
Right. Then this complex and potentially inefficient multi-layered distribution system dominated by entities like Zeno,
That created a shortage feeling by not fully meeting demand from wholesalers.
leading to that shift to a volatile spot market.
Opportunistic profit-taking within the distribution chain.
Speculation and hoarding by various players.
And perhaps an existing market system that was simply vulnerable and unprepared to handle the pressures of general inflation that were also present in the economy at the time.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of transparency and control, the sources point out issues with rice traceability too.
Knowing where the rice actually is.
Exactly. While the traceability law exists in Japan, apparently record-keeping within the distribution system is often fragmented, paper-based, and decentralized.
So no real-time overview.
It sounds like it makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the government to get a real-time, accurate picture of where rice is flowing throughout the country at any given moment and how much stock is actually available nationwide.
And that lack of visibility hinders the ability to identify bottlenecks quickly or respond effectively to market fluctuations, right?
Precisely. Your sources suggest that a centralized government database, perhaps utilizing a modern technology like AI, could significantly improve this visibility and allow for more informed interventions in the future.
Okay, so that covers the immediate crisis and its apparent causes. But let's unpack this further by stepping back and looking at the broader agricultural system itself, because the rice riot, while an immediate crisis,
Yes.
it really shone a spotlight on some deep-seated, long-standing structural challenges within Japanese agriculture, didn't it?
Absolutely. To truly understand the context of this crisis and the potential for future reforms, we really need to look at the historical foundations of the system.
Where does that history start?
Well, what's fascinating here is the historical context, particularly the post-World War II land reform implemented by the Allied occupation forces under GHQ, General Headquarters.
Oh, the post-war reforms.
Right. This reform broke up large land holdings and created a system of many small-scale independent farmers. Now, some historical analysis, including that referenced in your sources, argues that one intention behind this was perhaps to weaken Japanese agriculture relative to the large-scale farming common in the U.S.
To create a market for U.S. exports, potentially.
That's one interpretation discussed. Regardless of the original intent, this reform led directly to the creation of the Agricultural Cooperative System, JA, specifically designed to support these numerous small farmers.
By providing purchasing, selling, credit, and other services.
Exactly. And over time, JA, particularly its national federation Zeno, grew into an incredibly powerful and influential organization within Japan.
And that structure, rooted in the post-war era, is now facing a severe and, frankly, unavoidable demographic challenge.
The aging problem is huge.
Your sources highlight the rapidly aging farming population. The number of core farmers, defined as those primarily engaged in agriculture, is projected to drop dramatically.
How dramatically?
From about 1.2 million currently to potentially as low as 300,000 within just 20 years.
Wow, from 1.2 million down to 300,000. That's a massive decline. Imminent, too.
It is. And as older farmers retire, vast amounts of farmland are being abandoned, referred to as kyokoden.
Abandoned fields, you see them around the countryside.
Yeah. And land succession is also difficult due to various factors, including complex regulations and the fact that many small farms aren't structured as corporations, making transfer less straightforward.
So it's hard to pass the land on.
Which creates an urgent need, not just to support existing farmers, but to attract new entrants to agriculture and find ways to consolidate fragmented land into larger, more efficient operations.
Consolidation is key then.
It seems so. Some sources discuss potential incentives to encourage this, like offering temporary tax exemptions on lease income for older farmers willing to rent out their land rather than just abandon it.
Trying to keep the land in production.
Exactly.
This aging crisis and the structure of the agricultural sector bring us back to the role of JA and the ongoing debate around its reform, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Criticisms, as discussed in your sources, include the fact that the core economic and agricultural businesses of JA, like buying and selling produce or supplying inputs, are often not profitable on their own.
Really? How do they survive then?
Well, the cooperative's overall financial health and profit often rely heavily on its financial services division, things like lending money to farmers for equipment or providing insurance.
The banking side.
Right. This raises questions about whether the current structure is optimally serving the interests of farmers or primarily maintaining the cooperative's own vast organization.
And reforming JA is politically challenging, I imagine.
Hugely, because of its significant power and influence at the local level. Sometimes described, perhaps hyperbolically, but it makes the point,
Yeah.
with terms like village ostracism for farmers who attempt to operate outside the traditional JA channels.
Wow, that's strong.
The Ishigaki beef feed example mentioned in the sources, where local farmers apparently faced difficulty sourcing feed when they deviated from JA-approved standards. That's often cited as an illustration of the kind of control and influence JA can exert over local farming activities and market access.
So it's hard to go against the grain, so to speak.
Very difficult in some areas. And what's fascinating here is how these challenges intersect with the need for modernization and efficiency.
Because adopting modern agricultural technologies and techniques requires
Scale and investment, exactly. It's much harder for small, fragmented farms to invest in expensive machinery or complex data systems.
which points to the need for larger-scale farming operations and perhaps greater corporatization of agriculture.
Right. Your sources mentioned the slow but steady increase in agricultural production corporations, Nuji Seisanchujin, which are legally structured entities focused on farming.
So more business-like structures.
Yes. But there's a long-standing debate around allowing full corporations, kabushiki gaisha, the standard business company structure, more direct access to owning agricultural land.
Why the resistance to that?
Historically, concerns about corporations buying up farmland, speculation, maybe pushing out traditional farmers. Currently, there are restrictions on corporations owning farmland unless they meet specific, sometimes difficult conditions.
So it's limited.
It is. The sources mention the experiment in Yabru, Hyogo Prefecture, designated as a special zone where these restrictions were loosened to allow corporations in.
How'd that go?
Well, that experiment faced its own challenges, apparently, including some issues with integrating locally. But the accelerating reality of abandoned land due to the aging crisis may now create greater political will and necessity to expand such models.
Because someone needs to farm the land.
Exactly. Make it easier for well-resourced corporations to potentially enter farming and consolidate land, especially land that might otherwise be abandoned.
And this need for scale and investment is directly linked to the potential of digital transformation, or DX, and technology in agriculture, right?
Absolutely. The sources highlight the incredible potential here. Imagine using drones and satellite data, especially newer SAR satellites that can image the Earth regardless of weather conditions like clouds.
SARTAC, yeah. Seeing through clouds is a big deal.
Huge. To monitor crops with unprecedented detail, this technology can provide data on soil moisture levels, detect early signs of disease or pest infestation,
Pinpoint problems early.
and help farmers optimize the use of inputs like fertilizer and pesticides, applying them precisely where and when needed. Precision agriculture?
And the potential yield increase.
Your sources suggest that adopting these technologies could potentially increase yields by 30–50%.
30 to 50%, that's enormous.
It is. But again, realizing this potential requires significant upfront investment in technology and the scale of operations to make that investment worthwhile.
Which brings us back to consolidation and maybe corporatization.
It's all interconnected. Furthermore, satellite data could also provide much more accurate and real-time yield statistics compared to current methods.
Getting better data to avoid that paradox we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Potentially helping to avoid the kind of confusion between reported yield and market perceptions seen in the recent crisis.
Now, it's absolutely critical to acknowledge, though, that not all farmland in Japan is suited for large-scale, highly mechanized corporate farming.
That's a very important point. The mid-mountainous areas, known as Chusankanchi, they constitute a significant portion of the agricultural landscape and face distinct challenges.
Smaller fields, terraced land, harder to access.
Often, yes. But these areas provide crucial multifaceted functions, that go way beyond just food production.
What kind of functions?
Vital ecological services like water retention, they act like natural dams, helping regulate water flow and prevent downstream flooding. They preserve valuable landscapes and biodiversity and maintain cultural heritage, too. They're important in many ways.
So strategies for these mid-mountainous areas need to be different, right? More creative than just trying to scale up production like on the flatlands.
Absolutely. Your sources suggest focusing on strategies that leverage these other functions and add value in different ways.
It is.
This includes branding unique local products from these areas, adding value through processing or unique packaging, and crucially, combining agriculture with tourism.
Agritourism. That's a growing area.
Definitely. Developing minpaku, or guest houses on farms, actively attracting inbound tourists interested in authentic rural experiences, linking farming activities with other local products, cultural events, traditional assets like festivals, matsuri, or shrines that can create unique attractions.
Making the whole region a destination.
Exactly. The point is that farmers in these areas might not make a significant income just from selling their produce at standard market prices, but they are often deeply motivated to protect their land and way of life.
It's not just about the money for them.
Often not purely. The sources mention cases where older farmers are willing to lease their land for free to someone who will simply farm it and keep it maintained.
Just to keep it alive.
Which highlights that the motivation isn't purely economic in the traditional sense. This requires a different kind of support from the government and innovative thinking from local communities compared to policies aimed solely at large-scale commercial farming.
Okay, so let's unpack the potential future direction that the sources discuss, particularly how Japan might shift its focus outward, maybe internationally.
Yes. With the domestic population shrinking and the potential for that long-term rice separation impacting consumption, relying solely on the domestic market might not be sustainable or even desirable in the long run.
So they need other outlets.
Your sources discuss a significant pivot in government thinking away from the long-standing policy of controlling domestic supply through acreage reduction.
Acreage reduction, basically paying farmers not to grow rice on certain fields to manage price and surpluses. That's been around for ages.
It has. The shift is towards allowing freer supply and then managing any excess production through exit strategies.
Exit strategies like what?
Like export, international aid, or using the government stockpile more proactively.
This is a pretty fundamental philosophical shift then, from limiting supply to managing surplus.
It really is. The idea is to let farmers produce more freely and then manage any excess through these other avenues. And the export potential, as highlighted in your sources, seems significant.
Because Japanese rice has a good reputation globally.
Exactly. Given the widely recognized high quality of Japanese rice, often considered a premium product internationally, the argument is that it shouldn't just be viewed as a place to dump surplus production cheaply.
No, it should be marketed as premium.
Instead, exporting high-quality Japanese rice should become a strategic goal, a way to create new demand and value.
But achieving success in export, particularly for a premium product like that, requires strategic branding, doesn't it? You can't just ship it out.
Absolutely. Your sources emphasize this point strongly, drawing analogies to successful European agricultural exports. Think of French products like foie gras, wine, truffles.
Right, they have strong regional brands, cultural associations.
They aren't just sold as commodities, they are marketed as premium, high-quality goods linked to specific regions, traditions, culinary experiences. While Zeno currently exports around the $38 billion worth of agricultural products annually,
Which sounds like a lot.
it is, but your sources suggest that given its scale and resources, the potential is vastly higher if a more ambitious and strategically branded export approach is adopted for rice and other high-quality Japanese agricultural products.
So this raises a really important question.
Huh.
How exactly do you do that effectively? How do you build that premium brand globally?
Well, your sources offer some intriguing and quite specific ideas drawn from various discussions. One suggestion is to initially focus export efforts on Sekai rice.
That rice. Why
Yeah.
specifically that?
Because Japanese sake has seen growing popularity globally and has a very clear cultural connection to Japanese rice, it makes it a natural and recognizable entry point for branding efforts around premium Japanese rice varieties. People already associate Japan with quality sake.
Okay, that makes sense. Leverage the existing reputation of sake.
And it goes beyond just selling the rice itself. A compelling idea discussed is packaging and selling Japanese culture and the necessary tools alongside the rice.
Tools. Like what?
Like selling high-quality Japanese rice cookers, not just basic models, but premium ones, like, say, Vermicular's rice pot, or those traditional donabe-style machines designed to cook rice perfectly.
Ah, the idea being you need the right equipment to get the best result.
Exactly. These are seen as essential for truly experiencing delicious Japanese rice. The discussion also links this to traditional Japanese cooking knives, famous for their extreme sharpness and cultural link to dishes like sashimi.
You see those amazing knives in places like Kappabashi in Tokyo.
Right. The idea is to market these high-quality tools and the knowledge of preparation alongside the rice, reinforcing the notion that experiencing delicious Japanese rice is an entire package. The right ingredients, the right tools, the right technique, all rooted in Japanese culture.
That's a sophisticated marketing approach.
It is, and this can be further integrated with the growing global network of Japanese restaurants, which are spreading Japanese cuisine worldwide. Even ramen shops, which are ubiquitous abroad now,
It's everywhere, yeah.
are increasingly selling Japanese sake. That provides another potential channel to link Japanese food culture, including rice and sake, with international consumers.
Tap into that existing network.
Furthermore, leveraging Japan's incredibly successful character and intellectual property business, think of global icons like Pokemon or Hello Kitty,
Using characters to sell rice.
or drawing inspiration from traditional Japanese culture like yukai, supernatural beings, or the beloved worlds created by Studio Ghibli's Miyazaki. These could provide unique and globally appealing branding ideas for Japanese agriculture and rice. Tap into that cool Japan vibe.
Interesting. Use that cultural soft power.
Your sources even suggest the need for government-backed promotional campaigns on the scale of the highly successful inbound tourism push,
Which really worked for tourism.
and potentially bringing in people with extensive experience in global business and branding into government roles to really drive the strategy forward, people who know how to sell things internationally.
And promoting Japanese agriculture in specific regional areas ties directly back into inbound tourism, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The past bureaucratic resistance to significantly increasing tourist numbers seems to have largely been overcome, creating new opportunities.
So promote the regions themselves.
Promote regional assets like unique, vibrant festivals, matsuri, or historically significant shrines as distinct cultural experiences. Perhaps utilizing funding streams like the Culture Agency budget for international promotion.
Draw tourists directly to farming regions.
Exactly. This reinforces the potential of agritourism and provides a market for the unique offerings of those mid-mountainous areas we discussed earlier. It creates a virtuous cycle. Host, speaker, speaker.
So the future vision involves a significant shift then, moving away from managing supply through domestic restrictions towards proactively developing global export markets.
Right.
Strategically leveraging the high quality of Japanese rice and agricultural products. Host, speaker. Weaving into cultural branding and technology, and creating synergistic links with tourism to generate new value and ensure the long-term viability of diverse farming regions. It's a holistic approach.
So what does this all mean for the path forward then? The concrete steps needed? It sounds like it requires not just willingness, but significant policy changes and persistence to overcome these ingrained structures. Absolutely. Your sources discuss the critical need to fundamentally shift the allocation of government agricultural budget. That's where the rubber meets the road.
Okay, so where should the money go instead?
Redirecting funds away from supporting the old acreage reduction policies
Stop paying farmers not to grow rice.
and towards funding the necessary structural reforms. Things like supporting the move to large-scale farming, investing heavily in land consolidation.
You mentioned tochikairi.
Yes, your sources mention a large existing budget for tochikairi, or land improvement projects, which could potentially be leveraged or repurposed for consolidation efforts. Also, investing in DX and technology adoption.
Getting those drones and satellites working for farmers.
Funding strategic export promotion campaigns, and providing targeted support tailored for those important mid-mountain areas and for attracting new entrants into farming. It's about investing in the future structure, not maintaining the past one.
This is seen as crucial for modernizing, making the sector more efficient, and ensuring its sustainability in the face of that demographic decline.
But it's acknowledged that implementing this level of significant reform, particularly regarding powerful existing entities like JA, and changing traditional land use practices rooted in post-war history, it faces considerable resistance.
It won't be easy.
Definitely not. However, your sources emphasize that these reforms are not just desirable, they are increasingly seen as necessary, perhaps even unavoidable given the harsh demographic reality of a rapidly aging farming population and all that abandoned land. The status quo isn't sustainable.
What's fascinating here is how the Raider rice riot itself is being framed in hindsight. It was obviously a painful crisis for many people,
Yes, very destructive.
but it also served as a necessary, maybe overdue wake-up call.
Yeah.
Forcing prices to soar brought the underlying issues into stark relief.
It made people pay attention.
And for the first time in a significant way, it pushed these long-delayed discussions about structural problems and necessary reforms into the public consciousness. Your sources suggest that because the public is now widely discussing the proper price of rice and the fundamental future of agriculture in Japan.
A national conversation has started.
Exactly. This creates a potential window and maybe the momentum for change that simply wasn't there before the crisis hit.
Indeed. The outcome of this crisis may well be a fundamental reshaping of Japanese agriculture, accelerating a necessary transition towards greater efficiency, widespread technological adoption, a stronger presence in the global market,
While hopefully
also finding sustainable and valuable ways to preserve the unique cultural and environmental aspects of farming in the diverse regions of the country. It's a balancing act.
So what does all of this truly mean? The recent turmoil in Japanese rice prices wasn't just about a bad harvest or a simple equation of supply and demand, was it?
No, clearly not. It was a complex event highlighting the intricate interplay of a multi-layered and sometimes inefficient distribution system.
Right, the maze.
Powerful market psychology and speculation, historical agricultural structures going back decades,
The undeniable reality of an aging demographic crisis.
and the potential for technology, culture, and tourism to offer pathways forward.
The focus is now shifting, it seems, from simply managing the immediate crisis to grappling with fundamental reform of the entire agricultural system.
Rethinking export strategy is a core component, not just an afterthought.
And finding diverse, tailored ways to support different farming regions across the country, not a one-size-fits-all approach.
And this raises an important question for you, the listener, to ponder. As Japan navigates these complex challenges, balancing its deep-seated traditional rice culture and the livelihoods of its small-scale farmers with the pressing need for modernization, efficiency, and competitiveness in a global market. How might that tension be resolved?
Huge question.
And what role do your choices as a consumer, perhaps seeking out specific rice varieties, exploring agritourism, or considering the source of the food you eat, play in shaping the future landscape of Japanese agriculture? Your choices have an impact, too.
A lot to think about indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fascinating and complex world of Japan's rice challenge.